Mrs. Celia, with a face marked by time and a distant gaze, watched the hurried people on the streets through her window. She wasn't expecting visitors. Her children had long seemed to forget she existed. Her house, though modest, was a reflection of her life, full of memories of a warm past that now felt faded. But that day, the heavy silence of her apartment became unbearable. With a heavy heart, she put on her old coat and walked to the neighborhood square, despite the biting cold that seemed to freeze even her most vivid memories. The bare trees swayed sadly in the wind, and the overcast sky seemed to echo the loneliness she carried inside. When she arrived at the square, she sat on an empty bench watching the pigeons gather around her. That's when she noticed a young man leaning against a tree a few meters away. He was looking at her intently but without intimidation. There was something in his gaze that sparked a strange mix of curiosity and familiarity in her. Jonas, dressed in worn clothes and looking tired, was not an ordinary young man. He had a peculiar glint in his eyes, a genuine interest she had rarely seen. She looked away, trying to ignore the presence of this stranger, but she couldn't help stealing glances as if waiting for him to say something. And then, without knowing exactly why, Mrs. Celia offered him a slight smile. Maybe it was the hidden kindness in his gaze. Jonas took a few cautious steps toward the bench where Mrs. Celia was sitting, his eyes searching for approval before closing the distance between them. When she noticed his approach, she tensed slightly, averting her gaze as if to avoid an unwanted conversation. But there was a gentleness to him, almost childlike, that made her hesitate to pull away. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, with a shy smile that contrasted with the fatigue on his young face. His voice was soft, almost respectful, and Mrs. Celia felt her wariness fade, though she remained alert. They exchanged a few trivial words about the weather, the park, until he let slip, with a veiled melancholy, "I used to come here with my mom. I think she liked this place." His memory hung between them, casting a shared sadness that transcended time and the space they occupied. Hearing this, Mrs. Celia felt an immediate connection. She knew this pain well, the absence of loved ones who once seemed they'd never leave our side. She sighed, her eyes brimming with tears. The square was one of my favorite places too, back when I used to come with my kids. And in that exchange of memories, the silence filled with understanding. When Mrs. Celia returned to her quiet little apartment, the loneliness felt even more intense. The walls, always so familiar, now seemed to close in on her, as if even they were tired of witnessing her empty days. She sat in the armchair by the window, where she used to watch life pass by outside, and felt her heart tighten as she remembered the brief conversation with Jonas. She knew that opening up to someone, especially a young stranger, could bring new wounds. She thought of each missed birthday, each call her children stopped answering. At first, she had held a glimmer of hope that it was just a phase, but time brought the truth in the form of silence, a void now inhabiting every corner of her life. "Is it worth it?" she murmured, to no one but herself. Jonas seemed sincere, but she had been hurt before by people she trusted completely. She felt exhausted, as if there was no more room in her heart for hopes that someday might be crushed again. Somehow, though, his words lingered in her mind. She recalled the sincere look he'd given her as he spoke of his mother, the shadow of sadness that felt familiar. This unexpected bond made her wonder, had he too been let down by someone? The next morning, when Mrs. Celia went down to the square for her usual walk, the cold air felt less harsh. Maybe it was the timid sunlight breaking through the clouds, or perhaps, though she wouldn't admit it, she hoped to see Jonas again. With slow steps, she found the same bench as the day before, settling in as she looked around. And then, there he was. Jonas, with his unassuming manner and his ever-sincere smile, appeared from between the trees. As he approached, he reached inside his coat and pulled out a shiny red apple, extending it toward her. Mrs. Celia looked at the fruit with a surprise that made her eyes shine. In that simple, almost innocent gesture, there was a genuine generosity she hadn't felt in a long time. "It's for you," he said with a smile that brought warmth to the cold day. She took the fruit, hesitating as if she didn't quite deserve it. but something about his quiet kindness made her feel alive in a new way. "Thank you, Jonas," she murmured, her voice catching slightly. The young man sat beside her, and their conversation began to flow with surprising ease. He spoke about his days on the streets, about the cold and lonely nights he endured, and behind his easy smile, she saw a young man also marked by loss and solitude. But what touched her most was his optimism. Jonas talked about life with an enchanting simplicity, as if each day was a new chance to start again, even with the burdens he carried. "You seem happy," she said with a hint of admiration, looking at him as if she were seeing something precious. He laughed, shrugging. "Sometimes I think it's just stubbornness." Mrs. Célia looked at Jonas, her gaze drifting as if seeking the courage to say something that had weighed on her for years. She took a long sigh, and the words started to spill out, fragile and filled with a held-back sadness. "I have children, you know," she began, looking at her trembling hands. "But it's as if I don't. They rarely visit me." Her voice cracked with each sentence. "When they were little, they did everything to make me happy. I was their world. And now, I'm just a distant memory. They have their own families, their own lives. Maybe that's just how it goes." Jonas listened in silence, his eyes attentive, absorbing every word as if they were the story of someone he deeply cared about. Then he looked down, and for the first time, the usual lightness in his face gave way to a shadow. "I lost my mom too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was all I had. When she was gone, I had no place to return to, no one to hug me or tell me things would be okay." The silence between them grew dense, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence where pain was understood, where no words were needed to fill the emptiness they both felt. Mrs. Célia, touched by his story, felt her barriers of doubt and insecurity begin to crumble. Then she placed her hand gently over Jonas's, a subtle and unexpected gesture. He looked at her, surprised, but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "You know, Jonas, I don't think anyone should go through this alone," she said softly, but with determination. Jonas smiled, a different smile this time, one that seemed to say thank you without a single word. In that silent exchange, they both seemed to understand that they had found unexpected companionship, a relief from the weight of loneliness they had carried for so long. The next morning, Mrs. Célia noticed the furtive glances from a few neighbors at their windows, the whispers floating in the air as Jonas approached her door. Those murmurs came with harsh, judgmental looks, as if their friendship was something incomprehensible, almost wrong in the eyes of others. As he neared her for their usual morning conversation, Jonas sensed her hesitation, the slight withdrawal in her posture. His carefree smile faltered for a moment, realizing something was amiss. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Célia?" Jonas asked, trying to understand. She cast a glance at the surrounding windows, feeling the weight of others' opinions piling up. "Jonas, you know, people here are talking, questioning. Why would a young man like you living on the streets spend so much time with someone like me?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of doubt, of words she was beginning to internalize. Jonas's eyes dimmed a little as he understood what she was saying. "I just wanted to help, Mrs. Célia. I never meant to cause trouble," he said with such genuine sincerity that it made her heart ache. Mrs. Célia felt a lump in her throat. This friendship made her smile, filled an old emptiness, but was it worth facing the suspicions and prejudice? That night, alone in her small apartment, Mrs. Célia sat by the window, gazing down at the streetlights. The whispered words of her neighbors echoed in her mind, sounding like an invisible judgment. Why, after all, care so much about what they think? She asked herself in silence. She knew society had narrow eyes for a friendship between someone like her and someone like Jonas, a young man without a home or direction. And yet, in every conversation with him, every shared laugh, she felt her loneliness dissolve, if only for a moment. Jonas was, to her, a small breath of humanity amid the emptiness. She pondered, What hurts more, after all? Others' criticism or the loneliness weighing inside? Meanwhile, Jonas, sitting in his usual spot in the square, reflected too. He wondered if his presence was somehow complicating Mrs. Celia's life. He knew well how others' judgments could hurt, and he didn't want her to carry that burden. Part of him almost decided not to return, thinking it might be better to let their brief friendship fade before causing any harm. But something deeper drew them together. The next morning, almost as if by silent agreement, Jonas appeared in the square. Mrs. Celia was there, as always, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a small, genuine smile. He responded with a nod, and without words, they both understood that what they had was something worth protecting, regardless of the world's voices around them. That morning, as Jonas walked through the empty streets, he saw something unexpected. A plastic flower tossed in a trash can, its petals still intact, gleaming in the sunlight. The simplicity of that abandoned object caught his eye, and without a second thought, he picked it up carefully. He was certain that this flower would bring a smile to Mrs. Celia's face. Later, when he arrived at the square, there she was, sitting on her usual bench, her gaze drifting into the distance. Jonas approached, holding a small flower hidden behind his back. With an awkward gesture and a shy smile, he extended it to her. Mrs. Celia looked at the flower with surprise, her hands trembling as she took it. It was just a plastic flower, but the depth of that gesture warmed her heart. She looked at Jonas, her eyes welling up, unable to find words to express how she felt. That simple flower represented something she thought she had lost long ago. Spontaneous affection, a touch of tenderness in her otherwise lonely life. They shared a smile, and in that moment, the square around them seemed to take on new colors. Holding the flower carefully, Mrs. Celia felt as if she could make room for joy in her life once again. That humble gift symbolized a new chapter, where affection blossomed from an unlikely and transformative friendship. It was a gray afternoon and the air felt heavy, as if the weather mirrored what they both felt inside. Jonas and Mrs. Celia were sitting side by side on the park bench, immersed in a conversation that deepened in unexpected ways. Staring at the ground, Jonas finally broke the silence, sharing something he had carried alone for a long time. Sometimes, I feel like I'm just a leaf in the wind, with no direction. I'm afraid to get attached, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I've lost too many people. It feels like the more you care about someone, the harder it hurts when you lose them. And honestly, that scares me. He looked at her, unsure how his words would be received. Mrs. Celia listened closely, feeling a pang in her heart as she glimpsed the hidden pain in the young man's eyes. She reached out and held his hand gently, her wrinkled fingers wrapping around his with a warm familiarity. I understand, Jonas. I'm scared too. The fear of being alone has haunted me for years, but now I feel a new fear, the fear of losing your friendship. Her voice came out as a whisper, and she squeezed his hand a bit tighter, as if that gesture could solidify the bond between them. They looked at each other, and in that moment words felt unnecessary. Their presence filled the space between them in a way they both needed. From that confession, there was something deeper between them, a quiet bond born of shared vulnerability and empathy. Night fell heavily, and a storm swept through the neighborhood with full force. Lightning streaked across the sky and thunder echoed, mingling with the relentless sound of rain hitting the windows of Mrs. Celia's apartment. She was alone, curled up in her armchair, waiting for the storm to pass. She wasn't expecting anyone that night. It was a violent storm, and no one should be out in it. But when she heard a light knock on the door, her heart skipped a beat. Slowly, she opened the door, and there was Jonas, completely soaked, dripping from head to toe. His hair was plastered to his face, and his eyes shone with determination. He held a bag with bread and hot tea. I couldn't leave you alone tonight, he said with a shy smile. Mrs. Celia was speechless. With a kindness she hadn't felt in ages, she pulled him inside, handing him a towel as he dried off. They sat together, and she couldn't help but feel moved as she looked at the young man who, despite all his struggles, made sure to be by her side, ignoring the storm and discomfort. His presence that cold, frightening night was a gesture of friendship and loyalty so profound that no words could fully capture its impact on her heart. At that moment, Celia knew that Jonas was the most loyal friend she had ever had. The morning after the storm, something had changed in Mrs. Celia. Looking out the window, the neighborhood seemed more alive, the air fresher, and the sky, though still cloudy, held a different glow. For the first time in a long time, she felt a warmth in her chest that went beyond the simple comfort of companionship. Her friendship with Jonas was like a new window to the world, and the idea that happiness might still exist filled her with a strength she had long forgotten. Right there, she decided that she would live the rest of her life with more courage and joy, regardless of what others thought. She started making small plans for the future, something she hadn't done since her children had drifted away. Maybe planting flowers on the balcony, maybe visiting new places around the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Jonas, watching Mrs. Celia with admiration, felt inspired by the change he saw in her. With each smile of hers, a quiet hope grew within him, a desire to rewrite his own story. Inspired by her strength, he began to consider looking for a job, even something simple. He dreamed of finding a way to build something of his own, to be part of the world again, but with purpose. In those days, the friendship that had started as a chance for companionship turned into a new motivation to rebuild his life. Mrs. Celia and Jonas sat side by side on the bench where it all began, with the afternoon sun softly illuminating their faces. She looked at him with a gentle smile, her gaze conveying more than words could express. She took a deep breath and, her voice filled with emotion, said, "Thank you, Jonas. You've brought light to a part of my life that I thought was lost forever." Jonas, visibly moved, looked down, trying to hide his damp eyes. He wasn't used to receiving such sincere and heartfelt words. "You've changed my life too, Mrs. Celia. I didn't even know I could feel something like this again." He could barely finish the sentence but smiled softly, realizing that each had filled a void in the other, something no one else had been able to do. In that moment, without the need for further explanation, they both knew that amid so many uncertainties, they had found something rare and precious. On their last meeting in the square, the sky seemed clearer, as if mirroring the lightness they both now carried. Jonas, with a calm smile, held Mrs. Celia's hand and promised, "I'll keep coming whenever I can, no matter where I am." She squeezed his hand with a serene yet intense gaze he would never forget. "Knowing I have someone like you is a gift I never thought I'd receive," she replied, moved. They said their goodbyes, and as Jonas walked away, Mrs. Celia remained seated, following his steps until he disappeared around the corner. This time, however, she didn't feel the emptiness that used to consume her when people left. She understood that, even when he wasn't physically there, what they had built would stay with her always. With a peaceful sigh and a gentle smile, she knew that, in some way, this young man had rekindled the spark of hope she thought was gone. There, alone but stronger, Mrs. Celia looked around, noticing that for the first time in a long time the world felt a little less empty. Did you like the story? Comment below what you thought of this story, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.